know that for decades before the Reverend Martin Luther King rose out on the world stage, a steady stream of African American leaders was sailing 12,000 miles by steamship to India to study Gandhi. Some met with him, particularly in the 1930s, until the outbreak of World War II. Historians patiently researching in Black-owned U.S. newspapers and journals show that starting in the 1920s, more so in the 1930s, an interchange was occurring on waging nonviolence. Indians also were traveling to the United States to study and teach, bringing with them wisdom from the Indian nonviolent independence struggles. This sets the stage for our discussion. Professor Rajmohan Gandhi, grandson of Mohandas Gandhi, is a historian, biographer, commentator, and advocate for human rights. He currently serves as a research professor at the College of Education, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor Gandhi is involved in ongoing efforts to protect India's democratic institutions from attacks aimed at turning the country into a Hindu nationalist state, where Muslims, Christians, and the so-called low castes and untouchables can only live as second-class citizens. After Mohandas Gandhi was assassinated, the Reverend James M. Lawson arrived in India to teach for 3 years at Hislop College in the state of Maharashtra. There, he often met with individuals who had worked alongside Gandhi. He and other Black thinkers and leaders, often pastors or professors, upon returning home from India, actively shared Gandhi's theories and strategic insights with Mid-Atlantic Black community. Reverend Lawson returned to the United States in 1957, and within 2 years was based in Nashville, running workshops on nonviolent direct action for students who were eventually from all the city's universities and colleges. Reverend Lawson is today the convener of the James Lawson Institute, and he also teaches at the UCLA California State University Northridge, and has a monthly course in the Los Angeles Church where he formerly served as pastor. So happy to be with you both. So I'll get started. World over, the premier exemplar of knowledge on how to create nonviolent strategies and solutions remains Mohandas Gandhi. Yet he did not discover nonviolent struggle. Throughout human history, even in ancient times, nonviolent campaigns to dismantle injustices appear in virtually all cultural and religious traditions. And anyone who's tried to persuade a 2-year-old how to do something that they didn't actually want to do can understand that nonviolent resistance is a part of human nature. Though neither Gandhi nor King invented nonviolent struggle, each worked to experiment formally and systematically with how to use non-cooperation, the refusal to cooperate or obey, as a source of social power in order to dismantle, collapse, and disintegrate unjust structures. Now, my first question is, some hear that the leaders of the Indian independence movement passed along nonviolence to leaders of the civil rights movement, and they think that what they passed along was a kind of moralistic sermon. Professor Gandhi, can you shed a light on some of the strategic lessons around harnessing nonviolence that were communicated between the leaders of the Indian independence movement and civil rights movement beyond just overall moral attitude of nonviolence?
I will try. Thank you. You mentioned the stream of African-American individuals, thinkers who traveled to India and talked with Gandhi. And I'd like to mention that there was this extraordinary meeting in that sequence to which you referred in 1936, in February of 1936. Between 4 African Americans who were in India at the time and Gandhi. There was Howard Thurman, who afterwards became so famous. He was not that famous in 1936, theologian and philosopher who was then with Howard University. His wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, and their friends Edward and Finola Carroll. So they met Gandhi in 1936. In a small town in Western India called Bardoli. Now at this time, 36, Gandhi was trying to figure out the next steps in his struggle for India's freedom. The dramatic success of the Salt March had been followed by severe repression by the British Empire. Moreover, there was resistance in India to Gandhi's challenge that Hindu society should face up to its oppression of the low castes and the so-called untouchables. In some ways, in 1936, it seemed that Gandhi had reached a plateau. Now, he talked with the Thurmans and the Carrolls in Bardoli for 3 hours. Now, present at this meeting was Gandhi's brilliant secretary and aide, a man called Mahadev Desai, who by this time had worked at Gandhi's side for 19 years. Desai afterwards told Thurman that in all his years with Gandhi, he had never seen him greet a visitor so warmly. At this interview, Thurman would afterwards recall, Gandhi asked persistent, pragmatic questions about American Negroes, about the course of slavery, and how we had survived it. This is Thurman's recollection. Gandhi asked, is color prejudice growing or dying in the US? Does American law recognize marriages between blacks and whites? And so forth. So in this conversation, which was a practical conversation, not a moralistic conversation, about strategies and about real life, Gandhi described nonviolence as the greatest force in the world.
Yep.
And profoundly stirred by recollections of how African Americans had survived slavery and had resisted it, Gandhi made an observation that has made history. It was a prophecy, and I'll quote these words, well-known words to scholars. Gandhi said to the Thurmans and the Carrolls, well, if it comes true, it may be through the Negroes that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world, unquote. So in this 3-hour conversation, Gandhi gets the conviction, it hits him like a revelation that their history and struggle has prepared African Americans to give the world what it needs. So this is one example of the kind of interaction. And here I may also mention that some years after this, now in July 42, the war has started now. America has entered the Second World War. Gandhi writes a letter to President Roosevelt, and this is what he says in that letter. I venture to think that the Allied declaration that the Allies are fighting to make the world safe for freedom of the individual and for democracy sounds hollow so long as India and Africa are exploited by Great Britain, and as Gandhi, as long as America has the Negro problem in her own home, unquote. So this is a practical, you might say, interaction on the question of nonviolence.
Yeah, and I feel like they use that kind of hypocrisy in the struggle as a way of kind of making the state eventually bend. And Reverend Lawson, I'm curious, as one of the people who was so critical in taking Gandhi's strategies and bringing it to African Americans in the United States and then therefore the rest of the world, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your experience with nonviolence and how that contributed to the desegregation in Nashville.
And my colleague Rajmohan refers to this visit in 1936 with Gandhi, and I should say I do not remember when I first read it, but it was in 47, past 47 to 52. And it became a major document in my own sense, in my own life. His statement about perhaps it's through the Negro that the message can go. And of course, I think it has a lot of prophetic notions in it, but that's when I first met it. And I have relished it ever since. That incident with the Carrolls and the Thurmans, I learned about in the late 40s and became for me a central element of the shaping of my own nonviolence. I can teaching in the introductory classes that I do that major incident. I think it's the most important piece out of history. Howard Thurman had a very important also influence on me, because in 1947, my freshman year in college, I came to hear about for the first time the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a pacifist organization. I was already had given up on serving in anyone's army and on violence as being having any kind of effective consequences to offer me or others. And so when I discovered Howard Thurman's name as an officer, in fact, I think he was secretary of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, that made me feel that I was in joining the FR on the right track. That should be said. That's not a known story, but he was secretary of the National Council of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. So I think that episode with Gandhi and the Carrolls and the Thurmans is the critical episode from Gandhi. More significant than the black newspapers who liked Gandhi and wrote about him. Yeah, and more critical than other people who wrote about him. An unknown name in some of this story is William Stewart Nelson, a theologian at Howard University who went and spent some time with Gandhi and then came back to Howard University School of Religion and began to teach Gandhi and nonviolence. He was teaching there in the 50s and the 60s. His name is often not in the picture, but I happen to think that needs to be in the picture because one of the people he influenced a great deal was Kelly Miller Smith, who was a graduate of the School of Religion of Howard and became the man who went to First Baptist Church in Nashville as the pastor, was a staunch supporter of the Montgomery bus boycott from the point of view of nonviolence, and was the chair of the organization. He surrounded King, who was a part of the group of preachers that helped to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and then the Nashville Christian Leadership Council. So that's an important name that ought to be in this picture. Kelly was deeply impacted by William Stewart Nelson's teaching of Gandhi and nonviolence.
So it seems like this event in the 30s had this ripple effect going throughout the Black American organizing community and really shaping the terrain, if I'm hearing correct.
I disagree, Nicole. I disagree.
You disagree?
Yeah, because there was a lot of stuff that went on where basically the idea of nonviolence struggle was not picked up and used strategically. It was the Montgomery bus boycott that became the moment, and the campaigns that followed it. That is the evidence of the black struggle taking on the nonviolent understanding.
So just to reflect back, it seems like even though this event had happened, it wasn't until nonviolent strategies were being used in the campaign that
It wasn't until the Montgomery bus boycott that then it exploded in awareness across the country and got the support of very a lot of people of the Deep South, a lot of people of the South, a lot of clergy, especially, became leaders. It had effect out elsewhere as well. Thomas Kilgore was a pastor in New York, became one of the staunch supporters, money raisers for Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was a staunch friend of the King family. He became a practitioner of nonviolent struggle. So he's an example of one person, New York to Los Angeles, and who maintained that teaching and that work and continued that work as a pastor in his communities for change in the community. He was a part of the Los Angeles Civil Rights Movement. That's what they called it. And 2 or 3 human rights organizations he was a part of in Los Angeles that pushed changes here.
Could you speak a little bit to the ways that the strategies of nonviolence were communicated? Like, what was it like to transfer that knowledge? Was it through examples of successful campaigns, or was it, I mean, I know you in trainings experimented a lot with nonviolence. I'm really curious about how this, this thing that is part of human nature was actually then trained into system and used in campaigns, and how that knowledge was passed along. I'm wondering if either of you can speak to that.
But my first work was traveling across the southeastern part of the country, mostly working in many hot spots. For an example, I did a workshop in early January of 1958 with all 9 of the Little Rock students in the living room of Daisy Bates and her husband in Little Rock. Maybe a 2 to 3 hour workshop after school. That was my first contact with them. And I went back almost every week for about 6 months to continue visiting with them and learning from them and helping them understand their application of nonviolence. So I have friendships with them that have continued to this day as a consequence. I went into other hot spots, Birmingham. I began going to Birmingham in 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, and 63 of the Birmingham campaign. You won't find my name in any of the books about Birmingham, but I was there working with Fred Shuttlesworth, Jim Orange, the Thomas brothers, Charles Gillespie, Leslie and Nelson Smith, amid bombings and beatings that went on in Birmingham against some of them because of the work they were trying to do. So that was my work was troubleshooting. The Nashville campaign began because Kelly Miller Smith and the Nashville Christian Leadership Council, of which I was a member, decided in the fall of 58 that we were going to have a campaign of nonviolence that would demonstrate to the nation that Montgomery bus boycott was not an accident. Now, this is a critical book thing that's not in the books, because almost all of us related to SCLC, Dr. King and Joseph Lowry and Matthew McCullough, and Doug Moore, and a whole range of men involved, were very anxious to have the second campaign develop. We couldn't let Montgomery be by itself. And so the Nashville group of people who were friends decided to do a campaign, and I used the Gandhian Method. I reduced Gandhian methodology to 4 points: focus, negotiations, direct action campaign, and follow-up. So I deliberately strategized a 4-point Gandhian methodology for Nashville That became a part of the methodology of many other places. With SNCC, with SCLC for the rest of the decade. So when we organized it, we then organized a period of preparation. And that period of preparation began in September of 1959, and we recruited students. The academy pretends that the sit-in campaign was a spontaneous campaign.
Yeah, they always do.
Nonsense. It's the failure of the white academy to know what's actually going on and how history works. And so the Greensboro boys, freshmen, were encouraged by at least two people who I knew rather back then. And I myself did a workshop on nonviolence for at least one weekend in Greensboro before February the 1st, 1960. So, and one of the boys had a copy of the comic book on the Montgomery bus boycott and carried it with him, I'm told, and read it to others. So, we recruited, John Lewis was recruited by Kelly Miller Smith. I recruited Paul Laprade and Diane Nash and Curtis Murphy. I know those three who I was able to get hold of beforehand. So we recruited students and townspeople for the workshops in September through December in Nashville. So it was a planned movement. Well, I'm talking too much, but that needs to be we need to recognize that so much of the work was a strategic effort on the part of great numbers of people.
I'm going to come back to that in a couple of questions, but I want to dig in on that point more. Professor Gandhi, you were talking about how Gandhi had said nonviolence is the greatest force in the world, especially for the oppressed peoples, the Negro movement in America at the time. Could you talk about why? I feel like people who are watching this might not have as firm of a grasp on why is there strength in nonviolence? What is the source of that strength? Where is it coming from? And why did he believe it was so powerful?
Of course, it's obvious that it has a strategic value because you're fighting against a very powerful military establishment. And the other side is big guns. So a violent battle, even purely, you might say, from arithmetical calculation, you're not going to succeed against very powerful military forces. But there's a much deeper truth to nonviolent struggle. You see, Gandhi had experienced in his own life lots of humiliations. In South Africa, he was hounded many times. People know about how he was tossed out of his railway train, but that's a well-known incident. But there were numerous other incidents like that. And so many Indians and people all over the world had suffered from people who believed in supremacy, who believed in oppression, and they were suffering. And somewhere, Gandhi made this very deep recognition that his humiliation had to be undone. The humiliation of others had to be undone. But he was going to adopt violence and spread more humiliation and spread more hatred. That was only going to make the situation worse in the world as a whole. And so, and actually I heard this again is something that I heard from Reverend Lawson the other day. It was kind of an insight that Gandhi just realized that others should not go through what I have gone through. And so this was a tremendous insight. But then behind that insight, or linked to that insight, was this very great truth that really the world has endured for centuries. Yes, the world has seen oppression, but the world has endured for centuries because in so many small and large ways, people have exercised compassion and love and caring and justice and fight. So there was something very profound and powerful and universal and eternal in nonviolence. So Gandhi and others with him, hung on to that. So it was not practical to oppose the British Empire, racism in the United States with violence, but also nonviolence gave you tremendous strength. You tapped into something universal and eternal, and it gave the moral high ground to those who are fighting for justice. It gave the moral high ground to those fighting for justice.
I work with younger activists, a new generation of activists, and I train them on nonviolence often. And, I get a lot of skepticism, honestly, from them for a couple of reasons, one thing that they'll say is, well, how can you rely on some, humanity in your opposition, right? Like they believe that nonviolence is just a manifestation of trying to rely on sympathy in the person who's trying to oppress you, and they fundamentally don't believe in that. What would you say to the young organizers that I talk to on that point? This question can go for either of you.
So I'll give you a short answer, and then I'm sure Reverend Lawson will give you a more satisfying answer. But during the British rule over India, they had a viceroy called General Lord Wavell. And before he was commander-in-chief of the British forces in India and became viceroy, he was serving in North Africa in the Second World War. He had fought against the famous Nazi general Rommel. He was a military hero, this man Wavell, and he became politically the viceroy of India. In his diary, he didn't really like Gandhi because Gandhi frustrated the British, and Wavell disliked Gandhi. He wrote very critically of Gandhi in his journal. But he wrote in his journal, of all the people in the world who had opposed the British Empire, the toughest, the most determined, the most resolute was Gandhi.
Yep.
So I'll stop with that.
I would agree, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. All the other stuff was paled in comparison.
And
What the young organizers do not understand is that they are, especially young organizers in the United States, they have been weaned on USA culture of violence. So how can they expect that they will suddenly understand nonviolence when they've been weaned on racist violence, sexist violence, economic violence? They've been weaned even on the idea of some violent sports, basketball, football, hockey. So they are born and raised. They drank the milk of violence all their lives. So how would they then decide? But why don't they look around? Is not the 140 million people in the United States who struggle to have bread or shelter, is that not an example of the violence of the American scene? And how do they justify that? Is not plantation capitalism today that says workers don't need much to survive on, just as long as they do the work? They should live in poverty. How about that structural violence? And do they expect to remove structural violence with more structural violence?
That is the question. I mean, I think how I encounter it, I think they're a bit skeptical.
That's the problem of the country.
Yeah.
The country with its lofty philosophies in the preambles to the Declaration and the Constitution has persistently used ignoble, evil means to achieve democracy, and look where we are. That's perhaps the essential political problem in this country.
I couldn't agree with you more. All my work on at the moment is on this exact question. So
I just add something, if I may, Nicole.
Yeah.
So in December '64, that is when Dr. King was giving his speech in response to the Nobel Award.
Yes.
So this is what he said. Negroes of the United States, following the people of India, this is in his acceptance speech. Negroes of the United States, following the people of India, have demonstrated that nonviolence is not sterile passivity, but a powerful force which makes for social transformation.
Yeah. Engineers the power to change.
And I feel like what people who I train don't understand is how nonviolence can be used in order to grow a mass of civil resistance that can actually topple these structures. How it is a strategy, not just for one individual, though you can start there, but like the power of nonviolence to create a mass scale of people who will not cooperate with the status quo as it is, with the systems as they are, to use it as a way of creating social power. That's my observation, that often it's the link between the, ethos and spirit of nonviolence and the utility that it has, that's grounded in order to build social power in real ways. And I know that, Reverend Lawson, you've experimented with this and have seen the power of nonviolence to transform and crumble very deeply entrenched structures. So I don't know if you wanted to speak towards that any further.
In Georgia, in Arizona, and California, the people who have organized the changes that we saw in the election are all people fundamentally expounding a nonviolent philosophy of social change.
Say more about that, about how their voter registration efforts and the work they're doing is linked to nonviolence.
Well, remember, voter registration is a historic strategy of Black people reaching way back. And the white push against it indicates how important a strategy that is. From the white point of view, they don't like it. And I'll try to be very short. In both Georgia, Arizona, and California, the foundation for organizing has been essentially nonviolent philosophy. And in California, here, where I've had continued to participate in it, there has been a major tactic that we call face-to-face strategy. That is a nonviolent strategy. That is, that you go organizing that goes one at a time and faces one person and tries to help that person see the transformation that would occur when they decide to join a union or to vote, register to vote. Face-to-face strategy has been a major technique, so that, as an example, in Georgia, we had 400 people from Southern California who worked in Georgia for months in 2020 doing door-to-door organizing to vote and get out the vote. Door-to-door. 400. We had 400 people here doing it there. That's an example.
Yeah, I definitely see it. I think there's a question maybe I'll circle back to about, maybe I'll circle back to it in the future. I want to ask this question though, because
Gandhi had his hand up.
You had your hand up?
Yes,
I did.
Please, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to ask, Black Lives Matter was you might say, emulated, imitated, reproduced in many parts of the world.
Mhm.
Would that have happened had it been a violent movement?
I
You
I
know,
agree. I agree.
it's worth asking.
Yeah.
Would it have received such a tremendous, I mean, it expanded in a fabulous way inside the United States, city after city after city. It became a multiracial anti-racist movement. Would it have become that had it been a violent movement? So that's also worth asking. Yeah, that's all.
I think that's a good question for people to think about. I think what activists I would engage with are, I think there is I think they overall are nonviolent. They know they know that's the strategy, that will work. They know that is what most people are doing, and that's at the core of the movement. And I think there's also hesitation to criticize or fall in line with like mainstream voices who would point a finger at uprisings and rage and property destruction and label that as violent and kind of make that bad protesting and make what they're doing good protesting. And they're really keen to disrupt that sort of labeling of different varieties. That's what I think they would say in response, is that there's a relationship there between those efforts. But I agree, last summer's protests were overwhelmingly nonviolent all across the country and the world. But I did want to ask this question. I have a couple more questions. One is, Professor Gandhi, you were mentioning when Gandhi was in South Africa and the way that kind of molded him. And I have been to South Africa. I've trained activists there, and a lot of young activists in South Africa are a little bit upset with Gandhi at the moment and pretty suspicious of him, saying that when he was there, he put the rights of the Indian class in South Africa above that of the Black South Africans. And I hear a lot of young, even American organizers kind of labeling Gandhi and saying he was a racist. And so I'm curious what you would say to people who have that opinion of Gandhi or hold, maybe mistakes that he had earlier on in his life against him and kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater. Any thoughts or reflections?
No, I'm glad you answered that important question, because it is on many people's minds. So first of all, let me first give you the positive side. Have you heard of Albert Luthuli? He was the African National Congress president in the early 60s. And in 1960, he received the Nobel Prize.
Was it 60?
1960 or 61.
I've been thinking a different date in my head. Okay.
1960, I think, is when he received the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, 1960.
Yeah. So later, Mandela called Albert Luthuli, who was a militant fighter for African rights, called him a passionate disciple of Mahatma Gandhi. Mandela calls Luthuli a passionate disciple of Mahatma Gandhi. And Luthuli was, in 1948, in the United States, he was giving talks in various parts of the United States. One of these talks was at Howard University. And this remark of Luthuli is there in the Luthuli Museum in KwaZulu-Natal. It's preserved there. And he said there, referring to John Dube, D-U-B-E, the great, one of the founders of the African National Congress. We've heard of him. So Luthuli writes, or says to Howard University, that he had no doubt that Gandhi's efforts for his people, the Indians of South Africa, inspired people such as Dr. John Dewey and others to concern themselves with seeking human rights for their people. So yes, it's absolutely true that Gandhi did not directly engage in the struggle for the Black South Africans. But it is true that his fight for the Indians of South Africa inspired and gave an example and hope to the Black South Africans. Having said that, of course, it is true that in his early years, Gandhi was ignorant. He was prejudiced. I would absolutely disagree that he was a racist. He was prejudiced. He had absolutely ridiculous views about Africans. But every Indian at that time had ridiculous views about Africans.
And many people in the world.
And many people in the world. So I would absolutely say that to say Gandhi was ignorant, Gandhi was prejudiced, Gandhi was limited, absolutely right. Racist, in my opinion, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And of course, in 1908, when he was in South Africa, in a well-known recorded statement in Johannesburg to the YMCA, Gandhi said that he looks forward to a day when there will be a commingling of all the races of the world. And he mentioned the African race. A commingling, and you know what that word means.
Mm-hmm.
So this is in 1908 in South Africa. So yes, along with his ignorance and his prejudice at that time, he also had some remarkable visions at the time. And afterwards, as you know, Gandhi got not only the Indian government, but countries all over the world to fight as hard as anybody against apartheid in South Africa. So yes, all I can say to these activists in South Africa or elsewhere who have heard some things, it's so easy to discover something about somebody in the past and then label him just with that. But I would just ask people to study a bit more and get more of the facts.
Yes, and I go further than that. They have allowed the enemy of justice, the enemies of justice, the promoters of violence, to sow poison in them. That's where that's coming from, as far as I'm concerned. And it seems to me that one of the large things that has to be said is that he was so racist in South Africa that John Dewey and others organized an African National Congress around the same time to stop the rapaciousness of the Boer British rules. And they adopted nonviolence as their major philosophy. And they also adopted the nonviolent principle that they had to have an ANC which represented all kinds of people. All of that from this Gandhi. I mean, that's why I say point blank, those organizers are being fed a spiritual poison to undermine their chances to organize creatively and powerfully to change the world in which we live.
I would like to actually stay on this for a little bit longer, because when we were talking about, you mentioned voter registration as a key, tactic of the Southern freedom struggle, Black organizing tactics, even engagement in politics at all, even, the desire to fight for what happens in this country at all. Those are things that I've seen young organizers really skeptical about, kind of bringing up flaws, bringing up, oh, well, Gandhi was a racist. Oh, well, we could never transform anything that happens here, pointing to the imperfection of these systems as means of not engaging them at all. And I'm wondering if that's connected to this poison that you're talking about, if you know where the seed of that is. I wonder if you have thoughts on that this is kind of what I see, it is encouraging a younger generation in some ways to not actually engage in vying for power in this way. So I just offer that to you out of a purely, I don't know, that's on top of my head a lot when I'm thinking about organizing with young folks.
Since you referred to poison, I want to take this chance, and this is slightly moving away from our immediate subject of race in the United States, which is a very crucial one, but I want to mention it because it is a poison. You know that today all over the world, including in India, there is this new notion that liberty, equality, fraternity is outdated, that supremacy is the right doctrine.
Yeah.
The dominant should be supreme. The whites should be supreme in the United States, and the Hindus should be supreme in India.
Yeah.
And I know that India is only one of many countries, but India has 1.2 billion people in the world, and so many people of Indian origin are in the United States today. Many of them usefully helping also with the COVID question, doctors and so forth. But I want to take this chance, if you will allow me, to say solemnly that in India, Gandhi's legacy is in jeopardy today. Mm-hmm. India's democracy is in jeopardy today. India's newspapers, India's judges, India's police and enforcement agencies are under fierce pressure to disregard the constitution, which calls for equal protection, and to yield to majoritarian supremacy. This is the poison that I'm really concerned about. Mm-hmm. And I want to, American voices are influential in the world. They're influential in India. They make a difference. American opinion is not just the officials, an American newspaper, any voice expressed by an American at any level reaches India and influences India. So I want to say this. If it is, many people believe, some youngsters may not believe, but many people believe that Gandhi and the Indian freedom movement gave a great fillip to the movement for civil rights in the United States. Martin Luther King, of course, said that, but people may not want to believe him either, but that's okay. Many people say that, but if it is true that India helped the fight for justice in America, then now India's blacks, who are India's blacks? The Muslims, the Dalits, the indigenous tribals, India's blacks today ask for attention and sympathy from America, from Black Black Lives Matter. So I wanted to take this chance, make this appeal.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it's overdue. And I think, that touches on two questions that I'm curious about. One is, and maybe they're related. One, what are the ways that now these nonviolent strategies, this interconnectedness can actually go towards undoing some of these nationalist tendencies in India, in the UK, in the US, and all these countries across the world? Brazil, democracy is under threat. The idea that some people deserve to be there and others don't is gaining steam, even if, temporarily in the US we won the government. It's a very thin victory for the moment.
But it was a tremendous victory.
It was a tremendous victory, and it's very much in jeopardy. We have very long odds in the next elections. What does nonviolent struggle have to offer these struggles today? These struggles of, probably the next 10, 20 years of the fight between, white supremacy and hierarchy and multiracial democracy?
Well, I think you've asked a very, very important question. I certainly don't have answers for it, but I think we must take this further and discuss this more. But this is the great question to ask. We must, just to give one example, you mentioned recent developments, the wonderful developments, and they weren't, predictable entirely. They were not entirely predictable. So many courageous American individuals. Mm-hmm. Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and so many like her. And then these individual judges, these individual polling officers, some of them with Republican Party credentials, they all did the right thing. They did their duty where they were. Mm-hmm. And during the impeachment trial, those 9 people who were the impeachment managers? Mm-hmm. Did you look at those 9? 3 of them were women.
Yeah.
They represented different religions. They represented different sects, different races, different parts of the United States. And they worked as a team. It was that solidarity shown by those 9 people. There was this lady congressman from Virgin Islands, and there was this John Neguse from Colorado. These were people with such total integration, total partnership. So that is what is needed on a national scale, on an international scale. this partnership, solidarity beyond every limitation for justice, for equality, for liberty. So I'm very glad that you are thinking of this issue, not just an old man like me who's nostalgic about, there was a time when people in India did think that we were going to really show democracy of a interracial, interreligious, intercaste kind in the world. But that's now to one side. This new thing, this new poison has come. So I am absolutely delighted that you don't regard this question as irrelevant to our discussion.
I would never. It's central to our discussion, I think. Our tactics for throwing off white supremacy in the past must be revived for the present. Reverend Lawson, I'm wondering if you have any ideas on this question as well.
I think I'm going to say it boldly. The way in which the Democratic Party has operated in the past, especially its announcement of normalcy and centrism, will not do it. Only a hard-headed Martin Luther King Jr. philosophy and strategy will save the nation. The Democratic Party has to develop a strategic plan, which I do not hear yet. I think the first COVID bill is absolutely essential, and even more. But I do not hear a Democratic Party strategy. And the Republicans are already crowing that come 1922, they're going to win the Senate and the House back. But I do not see an emerging strategy from the Democratic Party. Our present plight in the United States, including with Trumpism, is also caused by the failure of the Democratic Party to give the nation a brief, strategic direction that cannot be centrist. I'll give one a strategy. I'll give one. If the Democratic Party were campaigning on the strengthening and inclusion of all Americans in the Social Security Act, many of the white people who voted for Trump would not be voting for Trump.
Yes, but I'm not sure history will allow for the Democratic Party to show leadership in that way. I'm more wondering what civil resistance.
Social Security is a Democratic Party idea.
Yes, but
from all perspectives, it's one of the most effective governmental programs for the well-being of their people that has ever been done.
But Social Security was passed through in moments when there was huge grassroots energy and demanding this level of action at the governmental level.
Bitterly fought. It was bitterly fought, Nicole. I mean, for example, so many black workers were left out of it. So one of the points of strength for justice for black workers is to be included in Social Security. And its bitterest enemies in the 30s came from the white supremacists and the segregation states. So but millions of white people know that Social Security has saved them from poverty in old age, past 65, 55. Many sons and daughters know that their parents have been able to do better than they'd ever been able to do before because of the Social Security check that comes in, which they have paid into and earned from their paying into it. So So the point I'm making to you is that the Democratic Party refuses to do the kind of nonviolent strategic strategizing that can appeal to all the people of the United States and that can resist white supremacy and resist greed and injustice, can change poverty.
So what needs to happen now, do you think, besides the Democratic Party deciding that they're going to, go out and actually pass these kinds of policies? What else does civil resistance, what else does nonviolent action and methods offer us for this moment?
Black Lives Matter campaign of 2020 is a greater blessing to the nation than what the Democratic Party knows. And I'm looking forward to it being renewed come the passing of the first 100 days. And in the 21st century, we must have campaign after campaign of nonviolence that can cause the Democratic Party to do more than it ever thought it could do. From my point of view, political social activism in the next, between about June and the next 3 years, must take responsibility for making the changes in the country that we need.
That's your mandate.
The only instrument we have besides nonviolent campaign, which could be a powerful force. Democratic Party is the only national entity that we have that might get some of the legislation through.
So I don't know whether this would be effective political strategy, but it might be, but I'll mention this. The whole world is facing, as you mentioned, Nicole, the whole world is facing this business of supremacy by the dominant group in the nation and the need for some kind of strong leader.
Yes.
Democratic leader. So if the world is like that, is America going to give a lead to this world? And what is the lead America? So that is the question that the next movement of Black Lives Matter should be asking, and how to demonstrate in the United States an answer to this world disease, to this world poison. So this may not be political strategy, but I think that's the kind of vision that we may have.
That's right.
Against which we might devise political strategies.
Yeah, and I think the U.S. is a country that is visible in a lot of ways. What happens usually that there could be a role to emulate what it should look like to make a democracy with integrity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that is a really good note to end it on. Maybe I have one more question before we do, which is, aside from this vision, what else is out there giving you all hope around what is lying ahead in the future, or what can be in the future? Silence.
To me, every single day brings some small signs of hope, tiny, tiny, tiny signs of hope. That is one. And let us not underestimate what happened in November 2020 and in January 2021 in Georgia. Let us not underestimate what happened.
Right.
I'm from Georgia, by the way, which is a little, I knew it was possible.
But beyond that, ultimately, I believe that this world is destined for progress, for liberty, for equality, for fraternity, and so that is an absolutely undeniable conviction in my heart. Of course, Martin Luther King spoke about the arc of history bending towards justice, but yes. Even if he hadn't said that, even if Gandhi hadn't said what he said, in my heart, I believe that.
And remember that before Georgia flipped, California flipped. Our delegation was governed by the Republican Party congresspeople. We now have a large majority of Democratic people, and that majority is going to increase in California.
So there are glimmers of hope on the horizon, and
remember that Arizona elected another Democratic senator.
And also the mobilization of the Native American communities in the election, which actually flipped the state, which was powerful and pretty new.
Yes, well, I think there's every reason to hope. In fact, there's more activism than we've ever had that is directed towards all kinds of goals. There are more nonprofits working on change in the United States than ever before. We had no such base, but the Gandhian philosophy of creating parallel institutions to do the work that the society is failing to do is a very, very important part of nonviolence in the United States today. The development of parallel institutions, nonprofits that do all sorts of important work of breaking down injustice and lifting up a nonviolent society.
Mm-hmm.
A very important piece of work.
Absolutely. And I feel like there's a role in the next couple of years for that sector to really, grapple for the reins of the country, and really bring that new society forward through our dominant institutions, because the task is in front of us. Well, I think I'll end it there, this conversation. And I thank you both very much for your time. It feels like very clearly from India, from South Africa to India to the United States and across the world, the role for nonviolent resistance and nonviolent methods is like critical for going forward and much needed considering what's in front of us. And so I thank you very much for this really incisive discussion.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicole.